The discussion will start with a keynote presentation that is going to give context, especially looking at issues of regressive taxation, and then we'll proceed with a panel of discussion that will dive deep into the issues, and then kickstarting the presentation, the keynote presentation will be no other than Ishmael Zulu, who is the Chief Policy Officer at Tax Justice Network Africa. Let me invite Ishmael to the podium. A round of applause as Ishmael is coming to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We can have the slides up now, if possible, from the media team. This is a joint session, and I'd just like to recognize the support and coordination that we have done with ZIMCODD from Zimbabwe, and also just appreciating some of the support we've received from Christian Aid to realize the work that we're doing here. So for this session, we'll talk a bit about regressive tax policies that we have seen coming from international financial institutions. This is a continuation of some of the discussions that we have already had over yesterday and part of today. So I strongly encourage you that during the Q&A session, if there's, especially in terms of mapping a way forward, feel free to contribute and share some of your thoughts. So in terms of the structure of my presentation, my presentation is based off of a study which is in its draft stages now, looking specifically at the tax implication of IFI policies. And I'm going to talk about the introduction and methodology, give a historical context, look at SAPs, and current contemporary issues with IFIs in Africa. So to start, our focus was on Zambia, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Ghana. And some of the results you'll find are quite similar and cross-cutting across the 4 countries. And we are looking specifically at how international financial institutions have impacted tax policy in Africa. And, I'll break my neck if I keep looking back. Yeah. Then we'll also look at the role that the IMF has played and the World Bank, specifically in terms of shaping tax policy. In terms of the methodology that we used, it was very simple. It was the mixed methods approach for the researchers in the room. We used both primary data collection. We set up key informant interviews. So we interviewed people from the Ministry of Finance in Ghana, Ministry of Finance in Zimbabwe, Ministry of Finance in Zambia, and in Kenya also we spoke to the revenue authorities, and they gave us information. And then in terms of research focus, the idea was to look comprehensively at the analysis of regressive taxation in Africa, and then we narrowed it down to those 4 countries. So let's look at a historical context. So in terms of how debt was used in pre-colonial Africa, this was colonial Africa rather. In colonial models, there was resource extraction. So the sort of economic structures that existed were that us as colonies in the African continent served the purposes of the colonial powers. So it was for exportation and extraction of resources which were to be shifted. In terms of utilization of debt, a lot of debt was procured by us, the colonies, and this was to facilitate resource extraction. So a perfect example of this was the colonial rail networks in Africa. I'm not sure about Ghana, but if you look at many railway systems that were left from colonial powers, they went from where the minerals were straight to the nearest port. Many of us can relate with that. And I wish I could say that This is something that only existed historically. Today, right now, between Angola, the DRC, and Zambia, there's an ongoing project called the Lobito Corridor Project. What's happening is the richest part of Zambia, which is called the Copper Belt, some of the wealthiest part of the DRC, that's in Kolwezi up there, a railway line is being built, supported by the US and Europe, creating a railway line that goes straight from those minerals rich areas straight to Angola, which is going to be, where there's a port that is closer to Europe and the US. The idea is that they are investing in this particular railway system, which will give them access to critical minerals on the African continent, like copper, cobalt, which are needed for the green transition. Unfortunately, the issue of our procuring debt for railway or architecture that facilitates extraction of resources is not something that's historical, but is presently happening. Now, in post-colonial, after gaining independence, when it came to debt and how the West controlled African countries, so the newly independent states were coming from a situation where, under the colonial powers, many of the needs, they served as extraction places. So they needed to invest in structures that served the purposes of the local people. So they needed resources and they needed to procure debt. And they also inherited what is known as odious debt. This is the debt that came from the colonial times. So if you look at the DRC example, Leopold is one of the method that he used during the colonial times was quite aggressive. The way that he ruled over the Congo was inhumane. It's very difficult to read some of the stories of how he ruled over it. And at the time, it was estimated that the Congo was owing Leopold around 500 million or $500 million US. That when the DRC gained its independence, there was a total debt of around 311 million inherited. So this hindered its economic growth. How can you then plan economic growth when you're owing such amounts of money to the Belgian government? And then there's also an example of South Africa. So post-apartheid South African government inherited debts. This is interesting because the debts that the South African government procured during the apartheid government were used to oppress the people. Then those same people that were oppressed needed to pay the money that they borrowed, the money that was borrowed by the government to oppress them. The South African people had to pay that debt. So you can see how our economic structures were in such a way that it kept many African countries in a tight position. So I've spoken a bit about odious debt, and then this brings us now to, if you fast forward, because of the post-colonial era, where we had inherited odious debts, many countries fell into a position where they were not economically sustainable. And that brought about the era where international financial institutions brought about structural adjustment programs. So the idea of structural adjustment programs was to restructure the productive capacity of developing countries to restore economic growth in these particular countries. That was the conception and that was the thinking. So in terms of how they went about doing it, they prioritized a fiscal deficit, reducing how much debt a country owes, tightening monetary policies, reducing too much government expenditure, and then also improving external balances. So in terms of how structural reforms played a critical role now, is in addition to those three areas, the fiscal debt, monetary policy, and external balances, what they sought to achieve was, in terms of our economic models, pushing for trade liberalization, pushing for deregulation. Where I'm from Zambia. There was a lot of regulation around private companies, but the IMF and World Bank pushed for deregulation, and then they also pushed for privatization. So when ultimately, what you will find is that after the SAPS period, there was fiscal and monetary indicators that improved over time. Generally, we saw an improvement in fiscal and monetary indicators. However, the economic expansion was not inclusive. In one of the earlier sessions this morning, we said that in Africa, the water flows upwards, not downwards. So you find that a lot of the benefits that we're seeing from the SAPS period, or where there was economic stability, were concentrated among the higher income groups. A lot of the challenges that we have on inequality in the African continent can be pointed back to the SAPS period and the way we structured our economies on account of SAPS. So now let's fast forward to today. Many of us in our respective countries either have engaged with the IMF or our governments are currently involved in an IMF program of some sort, or the World Bank. So these programs have direct implications on our tax systems in Africa. So the IMF, for instance, have the extended credit facility and the World Bank development loans. They are often linked to fiscal and structural adjustment programs that mandate tax reforms as a precondition for financial assistance. So they will tell you that if you want us to send you this money, we need you to change this tax system. We need you to remove subsidies on fuel. We need you to reinstate VAT on these particular products. They make them as a precondition. And African countries that are desperate for these resources, that are in tight fiscal positions, have no choice but to oblige. The IMF and World Bank have direct implications on our tax systems that many of us within our organizations have termed as regressive. So these preconditions have evolved over years. So during the SAPS period till now, they have evolved, but ultimately, they have focused on domestic revenue mobilization, trade liberalization, and fiscal discipline. So in terms of what they have pushed for specifically, they push for indirect taxation. Studies have shown how IMF and World Bank related programs have directly requested countries to focus on indirect taxation and focus on trade liberalization and easing conditions. So they will say you need to make sure that you have a market-friendly economy. You need to make sure that you are attracting foreign direct investment. You need to make sure you are creating a conducive environment for private sector. In a lot of their agreements, that is what they push for. So they favor economic liberalization and market efficiency, unfortunately, over redistributive fiscal policies. And what these things have done over a long period of time is exacerbate inequality. So in terms of what that means, in terms of analyzing the implications on African tax systems, a heavier burden is placed on low-income earners. And what's strange and what's interesting is that during the SAPS period, the IMF and World Bank have officially recognized how their policies have been regressive for African countries. Yet, till this day, the same policies, they've just changed the name. Instead of structural adjustment programs, it's called fiscal consolidation now. But it's basically the same thing. The same policies are being pushed for today. And these have pushed low-income earners into higher tax burden. Kenya, for example, saw protests where a lot of young people lost their lives. Protests where people's livelihoods were uprooted. Protests because they were being taxed too high. The World Bank and IMF, or the IMF specifically, was directly responsible for some of the tax-specific provisions that the youth in Kenya were not too pleased about, which contributed to the uproar and the protests that were happening. They've pushed for corporate tax rate reduction. So they've pushed for specific ways to set up the tax system in such a way that African countries are attracting foreign investment. And unfortunately, this also exacerbates inequalities because these only benefit those at the top, those with wealth, those with the capital. An analysis was done, and it showed that in Mozambique, IMF-led reforms resulted in the lowest income quintile, contributing a disproportionately higher share of tax. So the lower income quintile was essentially paying a higher share of their income in taxes compared to the richest quintile, directly because of IMF-led tax reforms. So when it comes to why they push some of these policies, they argue that fiscal discipline is important. They argue that efficient public spending is important. But then follow-up studies have shown that on account of this fiscal discipline and efficient public spending that they push, which in as much as is important, may not be done or implemented the correct way, has led to shortages of teachers, doctors, and civil servants. And those that are at the bottom, those that are poorest in society, are the ones that rely heavily on some of these services. The higher VAT rates, I think this one we are all on the same page. Higher VAT rates forces lower income households to cut back on essential goods. And then lastly, fiscal constraints on local governments limit investment in social infrastructure. So when you look at some of the agreements that we sign with the IMF, with the World Bank, they say we prioritize a lot of the commercial debt that we owe. Say we need to pay these debts. And when you look at our budget, you find that the paying back of these debts squeezes a lot of the social spending that countries are expected to spend. So as I close on my presentation, there's a specific quote that I wanted us to look at. This is something that was said in 2004. This was 21 years ago. This is something that was said by the then Minister of Finance in Zambia. Her name is Edith Nawakwi. And this is her speaking about how the IMF have influenced Zambia. So it reads, "We were told by advisors who included the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank that not in my lifetime would the price of copper change. They put production models on the table and told us that there was no copper in Changa mine. Mufulira was supposed to have 5 years life left, and all the production models that could be employed were showing that for the next 20 years, Zambian copper would not make a profit. Conversely, if we privatized, we would be able to access debt relief, and this would be a huge carrot in front of us. This is like waving medicine in front of a dying woman. We had no option but to go ahead." So for Zambia specifically, you can look at how the IMF, and this was the former Minister of Finance at the time, the IMF specifically said you must hand over your mines to private companies. A lot of the deals that were negotiated meant that they were given massive tax breaks. And they had no option but to do it because they presented economic models and said that you will not. Today, the price of copper is higher than it's ever been, showing that what they were using here was quite false. So this is just to show how historically, and unfortunately till this day, international financial institutions have pushed African countries to make certain tax provisions in their law that negatively affect African countries. When it comes to the conversation of decolonization, these two are massive entities that we need to have a serious conversation about in terms of how they are influencing African countries negatively. I will end my presentation there. Thank you.
Another round of applause to Ishmael. Thank you so very much, Ishmael, for setting the pace. You've talked a number of issues. You've highlighted the historical context of a date, and from the pre-colonial era, post-colonial era, how we got ourselves into what we are now. I don't want to preempt that because we have an able panel that is going to digest this whole thing. So allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to usher in a panel that will dive into the discussions that Ishmael has just presented. I have a panel of about 5 people. Let me invite them to the front, starting with the Executive Director for ZIMCODD, Mr. John Maketo. A big round of applause for John as he comes to the front. They have very long bios, which I would not take in the interest of time, so I will just mention them by names. You'll pardon me for that. And next to join John on the panel will be Mr. Uchizi Ngulube from ActionAid International. And then I will invite Aya Tobuo. I don't know if I've pronounced your name well. She kept whispering into my ears to how I should pronounce the surname, but I don't know if I've done it. All right, yeah, please come to the front. And then joining the panel again is no other than Samantha Kanoyangwa. I think I've pronounced that one well. Ishmael, you need also to come to the front, and these are the people that are going to help us digest the presentation and lead the panel this afternoon. So I'll give each one of you, except for Ishmael, 5 minutes each, just to speak to the issues from your own different perspectives. This is a very diverse panel, so they'll be speaking from their angles of their representation. So I'll give them 5 minutes each to set the pace. So starting with my dear lady here, you have the floor.
Hello, thank you so much. So I'm from the Global Initiative for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So I'll speak from the human rights perspective. And please, if you don't mind, I'll speak in French.
Now we need translation equipment for the panelists, please. The IT team.
Okay, perhaps in the interest of time, I would go back to English, because I had prepared everything in French, but it's fine. Okay. So, most of our, if I would say even all our African countries have ratified something called the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which is a legally binding instrument that enshrines most or all human rights. And you have to know the distinction, if I could use that word, between economic, social, and cultural rights and civil and political rights. And under economic, social, and cultural rights, you have the right to education, the right to health. These are rights that are enshrined in the African Charter. And for these rights to be actualized or to be materialized, we need public services, education and health. We need schools, we need teachers, we need nurses, we need doctors, etc. So these are public services. And under international human rights law, and even under the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, states have the obligation to use measures, such as legislative measures, but also other measures. And I will insist on the word other, to give effect to the rights enshrined in the Charter. And the other measures are like budgetary measures, but most importantly, the mobilization of their maximum available resources so that they can realize economic, social, and cultural rights, such as the right to education and health. Interestingly, in Article 29 of the African Charter, it is said that people have the duty to pay their taxes. And the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is mandated to interpret the Charter, says that this duty implies that states have to put in place fair taxation systems in the interest of, for budgetary processes in a way that they realize economic, social, and cultural rights, such as education and health. So actually, under international human rights law, there is a lot that has been said about taxation, but also about debt. And for example, in the case of debt, it is important that states, when they contract loans, they should not trade off on their obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. So for example, if they are contracting a loan with the IMF and the loan says you have to cut public spending on education and health, that is highly problematic under international human rights law. And unfortunately, in loan agreements, and especially I will take the example of the extended credit facility between this very country and the IMF, it is said that the country has to cap tax revenue that is normally ring-fenced towards earmark funds such as the Ghana Education Trust Fund and the National Health Fund as well. Fortunately, the capping on the Ghana Education Trust Fund has been lifted, but the problem still remains for the other earmarked funds such as the National Health Trust Fund. So austerity measures that are contained in these loan conditionalities prevent states from realizing their human rights obligation. That's what I want us to keep in mind. So it's very important for states to keep in mind anytime they engage with international financial institutions that actually the duty to fund public services such as education and health, it is not just a matter of economic policy. This is not just a technical matter that is for experts. It is a human rights issue. Because when public services are underfunded, when they are underdelivered, privatization is on the rise and unregulated, and also women have to step in to provide those services in the form of unpaid care work. And also vulnerable families have to make a very painful choice. Who goes to school? Who stays home? Of course, it's the little girl that will stay home to take care of the family. So this is the perspective I wanted to bring. Thank you.
And thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasant afternoon once again to be sharing this panel with these great minds and discussing a very important subject of interest. And I want to thank Ishmael for laying a very good foundation for this discussion, giving a very good and profound context on issues that confront us today, that have a historical a background. The issues that confront us today, they have a traceable historical background. I do think that it's always very important to always underline that. The reason I say this is that sometimes, just sometimes, not always, sometimes, as African people, I think we're too hard on ourselves. We judge ourselves too harshly, to the extent that we forget and exonerate all the, external factors driving our challenges, our economic development challenges. And therefore, this narrative has been supported, financed, and perpetuated, to the favor and the interest of a certain group. The issue of, tax justice, and as has been presented, I want to come in from the angle of debt restructuring to bring in tax relief. I also wanted to bring it home that whenever we're talking about taxes, whenever we're talking about debt, whenever we're talking about public finances, we are talking about citizen monies, citizen hard-earned money. And this makes us high-profile shareholders in the national purse. We do have a concern. So for me, tax justice, tax relief can be brought about significantly by restructuring our debt stock. And from ZIMCODD and SAPSIN, we undertook a regional survey that looked at different debt restructuring models that have been undertaken by at least 4 countries that were considered in the survey: Zambia, Malawi, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. Okay, I thought I was projecting. I'm wondering why people are looking at the screen. Thank you. Okay, all right. Yeah. So the 4 countries and beyond, there is some form of debt restructuring that is happening. If you look in a number of countries within the region, look at Zimbabwe, the structured debt dialogue, look at Mozambique, look at Zambia, look at Malawi, different countries in the region. There's some form of debt restructuring which is always happening. But the drive for us is to ensure that that form of debt restructuring brings about sustainable debt management. The intention is to avoid a recurrence of what Ishmael was talking about. Countries that enjoyed some form of debt relief, and the process, the debt trap, the debt crisis recurs again. That's not sustainability. Does not achieve sustainability. We want to ensure that once a country enjoys some form of debt restructuring, some form of debt relief, it's set on a trajectory to be economically emancipated from debt crisis. What are some of these fundamentals that are necessary for achieving such a sustainable debt restructuring? So number one, a sustainable debt restructuring is hinged on genuine policy and legal frameworks reform. And while undergoing these negotiations, it is important to ensure that internal debt governance systems are also brought about. So it's one thing to have your debt negotiations, restructuring with the creditors, but it's also another thing to improve your internal systems to ensure that new borrowings, new debt contraction actually sits on a trajectory to be contained and you don't go back to the challenges. And number two, effective debt restructuring should encompass all debts So we have observed a scenario that when countries undertake debt restructuring, they are restructuring a component of their total debt stock, not all of it. This arises as a result of 2 or 3 things. Number one, the negotiations and leverage that you have with the different creditors. So you may have some multilateral creditors agreeing to debt restructuring, and then you have other bilateral creditors not being part of that debt restructuring process. You can have negotiations under the Paris Club, for example, and then you have countries that you are owing that do not participate under the Paris Club arrangements. So that means you're going to restructure part of your total debt stock and leave out the other. So we recognize that that does not bring about lasting solutions, because we highlight the case of Malawi in 2024, where I think only a third of their total debt stock was restructured, while in Zambia, only 6.3 billion US dollars was restructured under the debt restructuring conversations. So without discounting the gains that will accrue from restructuring your debt, the idea of restructuring a portion or a component of your debt will not address the systemic and structural factors underlying debt distress. In the case of Zambia, which I highlighted, for debt restructuring to be at moderate risk, there is a need for cancellation of all interest payments, cancellation of two-thirds of principal payments. This is very important and fundamental. In all forms of debt restructuring, you need to put a cap. Put simply, you don't want to chase a moving target. There must be a limit. There must be a cap. Otherwise, talking about debt restructuring, sustainable debt, whilst the interests keep on accruing on an annual basis, on a monthly basis, does not solve the issue. Lastly, I think I highlighted this before, that debt, the recognition that debt is a political issue is very important. Again, in the case of Zambia, debt constituted a political and election issue, mainly from the opposition party. In addition to highlighting Zambia's unsustainable debts from China, the then new president took the question seriously till debt restructuring deal was successful. So I just want to pinpoint here that public debt is a foreign relations, international relations issue, economic issue, but also a very deeply political issue, which must be taken from that consideration. And our role as citizens is to use the power of the ballot to bring the authorities accountable using debt discourse. Bilateral conversations and complementary agreements are also important. I highlighted earlier on that you may find that external debt and domestic debt may be scattered across different creditors. It's important to pursue conversations with all our creditors and probably employ equal treatment in as far as you're treating the creditors. From Zimbabwe, our experiences have been that it is not helpful to treat one creditor better than the other. In 2016, we cleared our arrears, our loans with the IMF. To this day, we have a clean sheet with the International Monetary Fund. But because we are owing the World Bank, we are owing other members of the Paris Club. That has not helped anything in our situation. We are still considered a defaulter. So it's very important to pursue both ends, equal treatment of all the creditors, with a clear ideology on what it is exactly that you are seeking. Is it debt cancellation? Is it a debt relief? Debt relief sometimes involves a momentary suspension of interest accruing a suspension of debt servicing, which will resume at some point. But my encouragement and recommendation in this forum is to say we need to go for the big bite. Rather, we ask for debt cancellation than suspension. We must be clear that we do not have the resources and the luxury to service any debt at this particular situation because of attendant problems in our countries. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so very much, John. I think the last part of your statement put me at peace. Otherwise, I was going to take you back to say, I think we are sending conflicting messages. Since yesterday, the discussion has been around, we don't owe, we don't pay. And then why are we talking about restructuring now? So the last statement now gives me peace that I think that's the best way to go, debt cancellation. Thank you. Uchizi, I think as ActionAid, you've been doing quite a number of studies around these issues, issues of debt and how they are impacting on our livelihood. What's your take on the discussion at hand?
Okay, thank you, moderator, and thank you, TJNA, for the study and the findings that you've shared with us. I think you've rightfully put it. I think ActionAid, we've done quite a number of studies around debt, around tax, but I think speaking specifically to the case of Zambia, where I'm coming from, we've done quite a bit of work around basically anti-austerity. We know that right now, if it's Zambia, we are on our 13th IMF program. We're going on to our 14th, and I think that's something maybe a number of people in the audience may not be aware of. We've been under what we're calling the G20 Common Framework when it comes to debt restructuring. But I think as our colleague has mentioned, I think he outlined a best case scenario when it comes to debt restructuring. But I think at the end he hit the nail on the coffin when it comes to actually asking for debt cancellation and going for the big bite when it comes to our advocacy. Because I think when you look at our performance, particularly under the G20 Common Framework, you'll find that we were basically back to square one when it comes to our debt situation. I think we're all quite aware that in 2020, we defaulted on our debt. I think we're the first country during the COVID period to default on our debts. And since then, we hadn't been paying for our debt servicing costs. And I think that gave us a feeling of what debt cancellation would be, because during that period, we've seen increased spending on health, increased spending on education, social protection. I think we've had that kind of fiscal space when it comes to how much we can spend on the sectors that matter. And I think coming from the debt restructuring, but under the G20 Common Framework, which is an IMF program, we've seen that although we've managed to negotiate to restructure, I think about 90% of our debt, we still need to speak individually to countries to make sure that we actually actualize those agreements. And I think as we make progress with those countries, you'll find that the debt servicing cost is forever increasing. So I think next year, we're going to see our debt servicing cost basically back to where it was before we defaulted. And I think there have been projections from studies, I think, done by the Jubilee campaign that will probably be paying much more than we were before we defaulted. So it's just an indication that debt cancellation or debt restructuring rather, is not the solution, especially if we are to come out of this debt trap that we're currently in. I think secondly, looking at, and maybe tying it to the presentation from Ishmael, speaking particularly to tax. In the case of Zambia, again, we were on our 13th IMF program, and I think, to put it in a nutshell, basically, it's been implemented to perpetuate austerity, basically increasing tax revenue, mostly from regressive sources, and then at the same time cutting public expenditure to various sectors. So if you look at the Zambian national budget, for instance, you see that our debt, our total expenditure as a government over the last 3 to 4 years, as a percentage of GDP, has been decreasing, I think almost by 10% over the past 3 to 4 years. While if you look at taxation, you see that it's going in the opposite direction. So basically, it's a typical IMF austerity program, but it has been masked in a way, as Ishmael mentioned, to make it look like the IMF is reformed, to make it look like now they're looking at social protection and social spending. In the program we have with Zambia, you find that there's what they're calling a spending floor when it comes to social spending. And for us as ActionAid, we found that quite problematic, given that the spending floor is also quite vague, and it's put in monetary terms, not as a share of GDP. So you find that as a share of GDP, like I mentioned, spending on social sectors is actually falling, and is projected to fall even in the IMF's projections and our Ministry of Finance's projections as well. So I think that has also been a big challenge for us. We're also at a point where there's a lot of political influence on how services are delivered. So we introduced a new government, like my colleague has mentioned, spoke about how debt was politicized. And I think since then we've seen the introduction of free education. For instance, we've seen the recruitment of over 30,000 teachers, 11,000 health workers. And I think the problem for us now, especially as we restructure our debt and resume debt service obligations, is that there are question marks around the sustainability of these programs. So now basically our public services are essentially under pressure when it comes to how sustainable they are in the medium and long term. Yeah, so I think also maybe just to touch on some of the regressive reforms under the IMF program, and I think they were quite elaborate in the presentation, but I just want to highlight the issues around VAT. The IMF, the Ministry of Finance, under the advice of the IMF, have prioritized VAT as an avenue for revenue collection. I think mostly because it's an easy tax for them to collect, particularly from consumption and so on. But also, for us, we find it also quite regressive as a tax as well. Another issue that I think has been underlying, but I think was also highlighted in sessions yesterday, is the shifting narrative around illicit financial flows. I think for us, we've been advocating against, for instance, tax avoidance, against aggressive tax planning, and so on and so forth, which is very technical, it's very a high level, if I may say. And we've seen a shift, and I think even some of the sentiments from the Ministry of Finance here in Ghana yesterday echoed some of those, the new idea or the new look of illicit financial flows that I think is being pushed by these international financial institutions. And I think one of those is looking at corruption. For us, corruption is something that has been put in the forefront of where our problems lie as Zambia. But when you look at the share of corruption to what our illicit financial flow picture actually looks like, you find that corruption is a very small portion of how much we're actually losing. Another one is issues around smuggling and informality in various sectors such as mining, where the bigger companies are pushing this narrative that they are not the problem, but it's actually the informal miners, it's actually the smuggled goods that are coming into the country that are not being taxed. So I think that's another issue I just wanted to highlight, apart from those that were already highlighted by my colleagues. Maybe just as I close, I think another issue is maybe around gender. I think the IMF have been giving very vague advice around gender mainstreaming, around how we can protect or address the inequalities between men and women, and how we can protect issues around how women and girls are disadvantaged. So we do know that the IMF has got this mainstreaming strategy. It's something I think as civil society we've been speaking about since it was launched in 2022. But in the case of Zambia, again, you find that it's taken a backseat in terms of not only at the IMF, but also within our various government institutions. It's something that we just try to rubber stamp and act as if it's not a big issue. So I think that's another issue I just wanted to highlight before ending. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Uchizi. And coming to you, Samantha, from an Afronomics law perspective, what do you make out of this?
Thank you so much, Mike. Yeah, I'm Samantha and I'm coming from Afronomics law. And if Ndugu Mkasiri was in the room, he would say tax and debt are two sides of the same coin. And so when you think about it, really, it means, if you're looking at how we can get a fairer tax system or a fairer debt system, it would mean a more fairer global economic governance system for all. And I think it's very important for me to first start by just mentioning that coming from Afronomics law, our work has really been around the reform of the global financial architecture. And just connecting to what Ishmael has been saying, we think that if, for example, we are to have a fairer tax system that ensures that the multinational corporations, for example, are fairly taxed, then we also then curb, your transfer pricing, your profit shifting, and all those double taxation agreements that are a bit faulty. They don't mean that our governments would not have to rely so much on debt contraction. That is not bad, but at the moment we're relying on it to an extent that we are actually in default. And in some instances, coming from Zimbabwe, we know we are not even able to access any more credit lines because of that indebtedness. And so the role of international financial institutions cannot be understated, especially the IMF. We've done a lot of work under Afronomics law, the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network, where we really look at the role that the IMF has played right from the ESAP era, right through the austerity measures and the conditionalities that they impose as advice, in quotes, and also looking at how the role it plays in debt restructuring. We've heard about the G20 Common Framework. The IMF actually supports the G20 Common Framework by providing what they call the debt sustainability assessments. And these DSAs actually inform the framework, which is the common framework. And so we know Zambia, Ghana, and Ethiopia have had a hard time trying to get a debt resolution because the G20 itself is not working. First of all, the DSAs do not even encompass human rights considerations. They don't talk about gender considerations, climate change considerations. It is very blind to those kind of issues. And secondly, it's an ad hoc process. There's no predictability. No one really knows how it's going to work. It's all dependent on what the creditors will agree to. And the creditors are different. They have different wants, different needs. And so you also want to have the comparability of treatment as is in the case of Zambia. But we've heard from Comrade John from ZIMCODD to say it's difficult to have a common standard because all the creditors have different needs and different wants. And so these are some of the challenges that we've been facing when we're looking at the role that the IMF has played. What is the solution? We're saying the IMF has been in charge of the global economic governance for 80 years, and it has just been 80 years of misgovernance. So we really need to move away from the IMF. It can't be at the helm any longer. We can't be even talking about the reform because they don't even want to reform along the lines of human rights, gender, or even climate considerations. Why? Because the Americans have got 18% shareholdership, the quota system, they have 18%, and as Africans in total, we have 6%. It means each and every other country has got like 0.0 whatever until the whole of Africa totals 6%. And so if America says it does not want anything to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, it means we will not have economic policies that will cater for our women under gender. We will not have economic policies that will talk about climate change issues, mitigation, adaptation, and all of those issues. Our human rights will not be catered for. So I think what we have been talking about at the international level is to to say we really need to have the United Nations be the one that is in charge of the global economic governance. At least at the international, the United Nations would have, equal voices. Each country has got each vote, one vote, one country, and so it would be easier for us to communicate our needs and interests and at least have an equal voice, rather than at the IMF, where it is a very unfair and unbalanced system. I also want to talk about the role of the IMF in its extended facility program that it has, the extended credit facility, we call it the ECF, extended credit facility. And it's a bailout program that they have, and I understand Ghana has one, Zambia has one, and Malawi had one at some point, but then it was terminated, because there was no review, I think after 18 months or something like that. And when they have that bailout program, it's essentially to support you while you work on your own internal debt restructuring, and also, connect with your creditors and talk about how you restructure your debt. So you can imagine the kind of advice that these countries are getting while they're getting these bailout packages. We call it a bailout because you're essentially bailing them out. Like bailing out someone from jail. So in a sense, you're a savior, you're saving someone. So it follows that surely that someone will feel some kind of indebtedness to you, like, thank you for saving me. And so if they tell you do this, you're likely to do it. And so those are some of the issues that we also need to be looking at. What role is the IMF playing as governments engage their creditors to come to a debt resolution? I think I'll rest here for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A big round of applause for our panelists. I will now open the floor for questions and comments, in case you have any question or comment on the discussion that our panelists were discussing. By show of hands, I will recognize you and I will ask there is a hand there. Then I'll come to you. Yes, go ahead.
Bonjour tout le monde, je vais parler en français. Moi, c'est Kamadi Demba, je viens du Tchad. Je représente le groupe des travailleurs à la conférence. Déjà, mes félicitations à tous nos panélistes pour ces très belles interventions. Et mon observation finira par une question pour un échange de bons procédés ou un partage de bonnes pratiques concernant les réformes au niveau local pour effectivement demander plus de transparence autour de la dette. Déjà que depuis hier, nous écoutons qu'il faut parler de la réforme de la dette, de la réforme, il faut restructurer, que le FMI et toutes les institutions internationales devraient tenir compte des informations élémentaires, notamment sur les questions des droits humains, les questions des femmes, des jeunes, et que tout cela devrait plutôt être focalisé sur la protection des droits de l'homme. Mais il y a aussi une caricature qui est importante et qui doit nous interpeller, celle de voir effectivement que d'un côté, nous avons une dette qui est légitime au vu des arguments politiques et une dette qui est illégitime au vu des revendications sociales et de l'accroissement des inégalités dans nos différentes sociétés. Et donc, lorsque nous pensons, nos gouvernements avancent les arguments disant que la dette, c'est pour les questions de développement, cela suppose que le développement qui concerne nos populations devrait être normalement consulté, ils devraient marquer leur accord, leur adhésion et effectivement décider du mécanisme de transparence autour de la dette qui doit être faite. Si une dette, elle est publique, son mécanisme de suivi, d'évaluation et de transparence devait être public aussi. Que le dernier travailleur qui paye les taxes et les impôts qui sont plus ou moins redirigés vers le remboursement de cette dette-là, ils se disent qu'effectivement cette dette a été profitable à mon niveau, à mon activité, à mon développement et que cela m'a permis d'accéder à un certain nombre de services publics, de l'eau, de l'éducation, de la santé ou du transport. Mais cela n'est pas le cas. Dans la plupart des réformes qui sont demandées ou bien imposées par les institutions internationales, elles demandent par exemple au gouvernement de maîtriser les dépenses publiques. La première dépense publique, ce sont les salaires, ce sont les revenus. Et donc, quand le gouvernement, vous avez en face un gouvernement aussi corrompu, un gouvernement qui n'est pas transparent, qui injecte de l'argent dans des secteurs qui ne sont pas prioritaires, comment une institution internationale lui demandera de faire des réformes tout en sachant que dès qu'elle fera ces réformes, ce sont les travailleurs, c'est ceux qui disposent d'un revenu, d'une activité ou bien qui contribuent aux dépenses publiques qui seront tout simplement affectés. Et nous disons non, non tout simplement parce que aujourd'hui, si les institutions internationales sont à même de se lever un bon matin et de remettre de l'argent à nos gouvernements parce qu'ils ont sollicité, nous demandons aussi à être associés au processus. Lorsque nous allons à des réunions avec la Banque mondiale, pour leur dire, mais pourquoi vous nous consultez au suivi et évaluation et lorsque vous accordez l'argent à nos gouvernements, vous ne nous consultez pas? Quels sont les secteurs prioritaires sur lesquels vous avez injecté cet argent? Vous demandez, par exemple, qu'il y ait un budget sensible aux genre. Mais lorsque le budget de la défense est plus élevé que celui du ministère de l'Éducation, du ministère de la Santé ou même du ministère de la Femme, mais c'est un paradoxe total. Nous, ce que nous demandons tout simplement, c'est que la dette tout simplement doit être annulée, mais les mécanismes d'annulation ou bien de mobilisation autour doivent commencer par les localités. Je vous assure que si aujourd'hui nous parlons à nos populations dans nos langues locales, dans nos langues maternelles, on leur dit quel est l'impact de la dette dans leur vie, mais je vous assure, on va avoir un mouvement d'ensemble et puis demander tout simplement, ça va créer une instabilité politique et sociale dans nos États. Et nous devrons arriver à ce niveau. Parce que trop, c'est trop. Injuste, elle l'est. Et aujourd'hui, la pauvreté ou l'austérité dans laquelle nous vivons, nous demandons un nouvel ordre social. Nous demandons de nouvelles réformes. Des réformes dans lesquelles les peuples sont en avant. Des réformes dans lesquelles les femmes, les jeunes, les enfants, les villageois, les agriculteurs ont leur mot à dire. Pas des réformes enclenchées ou bien réformées dans les tiroirs ou dans les bureaux qui sont loin de nos populations. Qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire à notre niveau local et qui pourrait, par exemple, amener nos populations à se mobiliser? Si vous avez des bonnes pratiques autour, merci bien de les partager afin que nous puissions vraiment faire le rapport de force en face de nos gouvernements. Merci.
Yeah, thank you very much. Quite comprehensive and passionate presentation there. We take the next hand there. Yeah, and then we'll come here.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Joseph. I'm from Zimbabwe, and I'm with Aphrodite. Thank you so much, Ishmael, for the historical background. It has been very insightful. So mine is more of a question. For the first time, maybe since in June, we've seen the US national debt. It has surpassed its GDP, and the US government, under the guidance of President Donald Trump, has been doing everything in its power to curb and control expenditures with such initiatives as cutting the US aid and passing the Big Beautiful Bill. Countries also like Ukraine, as we all know, Ukraine is a war, is being ravaged by war. Its national debt has also surpassed its GDP, but these countries are still doing well, if I may say. But it's a different story when we come back home. Here back in Africa, it seems like a lot of African nations, they seem to be choking under the national debt. So my question to the panel is, what is the difference between developed countries' national debt and the developing countries' national debt? That would be my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. We go to, you want to ask Wells?
Just a comment.
All right, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for the great presentations. I think mine is just a reflection on the localization drive of this discussion. Reflecting back from our countries, I see that maybe taking it from the educational system angle, where we need to also decolonize our educational system. because this subject is very key and very important. But I don't know about your countries, but from where I'm coming, Malawi, you will note that even at university level, this discussion is not there. Some of us started hearing these things when we started working for Action Aid and the like. And also taking advantage of the primary, secondary. I think for us to effectively mobilize the next generation of young people, we really need to see how best we can influence our education curriculum at the different tertiary levels to make sure that we're also building the next activists who should continue the mantra. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very viable contribution. I think looking forward, how do we take these discussions into our education institutions? Yes, we start with the mom there.
Oh, you want me to start?
Yes, please start. And then, yeah.
Is there someone who can translate for me? I want to ask language. Ishmael.
Unfortunately,
Honorable
Shabalala is
worry,
not
I'm
here.
teasing today.
Thank you. Proceed.
So, as I said, my name is Peli Sangom. I'm a feminist economist based in South Africa. I also chair the board of Oxfam South Africa. And I'm probably, with my question, I'm going to reveal my age. Because I know this conversation, I used to join when I was 22 years old. And I'm turning something now. You can imagine how long has it been. And one of the key things I'm interested to hear, it's whether have we seen amongst the new leaders and politicians emerging within Africa, taking interest in the debt issue. And I think you think, I think Kenya, for example, remains one of the examples unto which where younger people took up fiscal policy-related issues. But outside of that, I mean, I don't remember, even from South Africa, we've not had, we have one of the most vibrant democracies and strong civil society organizations. And I'm keen to hear that reflection, because why this question is important is for us to begin to actually think differently on how we need to structure our advocacy work. Because without Parliament supporting this and having a strong debate, in South Africa, for instance, one of the political parties, which probably many people in Africa know, EFF under Julius Malema, had filed a legislation just 2 weeks ago, and I was doing a commentary there, where actually amongst the key things they're demanding is that there must be regulation that is compelling the executive to actually take through every loan that they undertake. It must be taken through to Parliament. And I think for me, that's one step of being progressive. But I mean, then what happens to other countries? And I think we could start learning from there. So I think the point that was made here is that debt is also a political economic question. It's not only a macroeconomic question. So where do we see an alignment within the continent? Where can we see pockets of that emerging so that we intensify the support? So for instance, as I'm saying, if part of what AfroDat conference could be is that we support what EFF is doing in South Africa. Let's move, let's see that happening in another country. Let's see other MPs doing this in another country. And it's good to have MPs with us in the room. And I think amongst the key things is to commit into, from an African perspective, what type of program would they be taking up around this debt management? Because it's trapping Africans into perpetual poverty, intergenerational poverty, not only even instability, but fundamentally the national psyche of lacking confidence to interface with life because they are forever trapped into poverty. So I do think that for me, and I know that I've expanded my point, but I think I want to hear a lot more on what are we assessing from a political perspective within the continent around integrating this within legislation development and parliamentary discourse. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, next, it's you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists for the enlightening conversation so far. I just have 2 short points to add or reflect on. Firstly is the need to strengthen our domestic frameworks when it comes to debt contracting and restructuring and financing. For me, I have a background in law, and I come from Malawi, where we have laws on debt contracting, but the terminology of our laws are so weak and vague. And there are papers and studies that have been conducted by organizations such as IFIs, and they have shown that this trend is spread out throughout Africa. Our laws on debt contracting, debt financing, debt management in Africa are so vague. We use terms such as contracting debt for the public good. And then you ask your parliamentarians, what is the public good? Who is the public? What is this good that is being sought after? And there's no definition. It's more left to the whims of the parliamentarians. So I think there needs to be a regional and continental push to reform the legal frameworks that inform our debt contracting processes. And finally, there was mention of gender mainstreaming when it comes to the issue of debt restructuring and contracting and management. For me, I feel like we could have gone deeper on that. So I think gender mainstreaming cannot be understated, because at the end of the day, as highlighted by the first speaker, when IFIs impose their austerity measures or cut down the public sector services, it is women and girls who take up the brunt of the unpaid care work that compensates for the gap created. It is also women and girls who are made to take up more tasks, right? For example, the COVID situation. The government could not take care of the whole society, and it was women and girls who were going to the hospitals to feed people, to support the sick. So it is important that when we're discussing the issue of debt, gender mainstreaming needs to be prioritized. And at the same time, it is a concern that when we're discussing issues of debt contracting, it is women and girls who are kept out of the conversation, either through the terminology or the rooms in which these conversations are had. These conversations are high technical level meetings where women and girls who are most impacted by the austerity measures and the other IFI preconditions are imposed on. They're the ones who bear the brunt, but they're not at the center of the conversation. They're not included in those conversations. And then the final documents that come out of these conversations do not even try to be relatable to the women and girls who are most impacted by the debt contracting terms that we get into. So my plea always remains the same, that we need to really have a meaningful push to include the most affected populations, and these can be included through gender mainstreaming. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I will give it back to the panel. 2 minutes each. As you are taking the questions, you are also finalizing on your parting shots. So starting with, John, you want to start? Okay.
I want to respond to one question.
And your parting shots as well. 2 minutes.
Okay.
Please.
A question by my brother from Afrodad. I think a very critical question. What is the difference between developed countries' debt and developing countries' debt? I think that question lies in understanding the global financial architecture. So I was just trying to establish here who sets the rules. Someone earlier made reference to the issue of debt sustainability analysis framework, DSA. So that analysis is meant to govern the main borrowers. The world, we are not equal. If I may respond to you, we are not equal. Some animals, some countries are more equal than others. And I think the issue goes further. You also want to look at where do we borrow usually. We are borrowing from these countries in the north. And when they borrow, they are also borrowing from these multilateral institutions. And you want to dissect the multilateral institutions, your IMF, your World Bank, These are institutions that are dominated by these powerful nations that you're making reference to. The United States of America, end of 2024, their debt to GDP ratio was above 123%. And yet the considered average permissible debt to GDP ratio is around 60-70%. But theirs can go past their GDP, 123%. The United Kingdom, end of 2024, actually this year, around July, the United Kingdom debt to GDP ratio was around 96%. Those are weirdly high debt to GDP ratios. They should be considered to be in debt distress. But you never hear such comments. When you do credit rating, those countries are in a better position than ours. So here's the thing. We are found in a more disadvantaged position because these are the powers that dominate the multilateral institutions. The fund, the IMF, is made up of 190 countries. Each of us, we have a stake through quota subscriptions. But the amount that you contribute to the fund determines your voting power, determines your stake and shareholding in the IMF. What that literally means is that your contribution to the IMF determines how much you can access to the fund. So the United States of America, the last time I checked, I think they have more than 20% in terms of voting power in the World Bank and in the IMF. That means they can go as much as 120%, but they still have access to borrow. They have a veto power to say Zimbabwe cannot access loans, concessional loans from the World Bank because we said so. The world is unfair. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Uchizi?
Okay, thank you. I'll add to that question first and foremost. Yeah, I think apart from what my colleague has mentioned around the global financial architecture, I think maybe just to add, it's also looking at, I think it's an extension of that issue, but when you look at countries specifically, when they try to be innovative, when they try to think of new ways to raise revenue, you find that some of these solutions, if they don't fall in line with what, for instance, the IMF is advising, it can't take any footing in how they raise resources and how they get out of their debt challenge. But I think the comment on also the composition of the debt that they have, I think when you look at countries like you mentioned, the US, Japan, who have extremely high debt to GDP ratios, you find a lot of that debt is in their own currency, it's domestic debt. They don't have that exchange rate risk when it comes to them paying back those debts. So I think it's much more sustainable for them. But it's also speaking to the current system that we're working within. I think the comment from ActionAid from Wales, I think you also had a good point around education and the systems that we're working within. There's definitely much more, we need much more emphasis around some of these issues that affect us as people. I think similar to your situation, some of these issues were only preview to us when we got into the space, and when you move out of the civil society space, out of the areas that we work in, you find that many people are unaware of, for instance, how much influence the IMF has on our policies, extending from corruption to fuel prices, to electricity tariffs, and so on. All of that can be tied to the IMF, but you find that a general or a regular person would not know that is actually the case. So I think education is still something we still need to work on. And then I think maybe I'll just close with the issue around gender. Yes, definitely it was it was just on the surface, looking at time. But yeah, I think when it comes to gender mainstreaming, I think it's something we always tend to miss, and when governments do try to address the issues, it's very surface level. I'll give an example of Zambia again, something that we had been advocating for, and I think a challenge we found that is changes in gender or gender mainstreaming is usually not transformative. It's just for the sake of the policy paper, for the sake of checking a box, but in practical terms, you find that there's very little change. In Zambia, we recently got our revenue authority to start reporting gender disaggregated data. But again, we found that was it wasn't very transformative in terms of how it will affect women and girls, how it will address inequalities. And I think that stems from our lack of understanding of some of these issues. So I think maybe I will stop there for now. Or maybe just another comment on the first question around legitimate debt versus illegitimate debt. And tying it to the laws that we have. For us, again, in the space of Zambia, you find that we have a brand new law that governs debt contraction. It governs oversight from Parliament. And from a distance, it does look like it is a very progressive law. But you find that when it comes to oversight, it's still very limited when it comes to how much MPs can influence in our debt contraction. You find that they can only look at an annual debt borrowing plan, which they can approve or not approve, but usually when it goes to Parliament, there's nothing that's stopping it from being approved. So apart from that, there's very little oversight in terms of loan by loan oversight in the case of Zambia. So I think it's something that we also have an issue around transparency, around how those loans are then used and how much they cost and details regarding to the terms and conditions of those loans. So I think it's still a big challenge, and I'll end there.
Yeah, thank you. Pass it to Aya.
Thank you so much. I would like also to supplement my neighbor's response on the difference between developed countries' debt and developing countries' debt. In which currency are our debts? Most of the time, USD. It is not our own currency. That means you have to use your currency and also multiply it by the foreign exchange and then buy dollars and then pay the debt. And one morning they can get up and say, okay, $1 is like 1,000 of your currency. What can you do about it? By the time you finish, you'll never end up paying debt. The US, they can print their own money because it's in USD. Also, the issue of interest rate. Germany, they can repay their debt with an interest rate as low as, I think, 0.8%. And that's not the case for us. It can be as high as 9 or 10%. So that's also another issue that explains the debt trap in which developing countries are. Now, to come to the question about decolonizing our education system or including discussions around economic justice at school, I'll give concrete solutions. We all went to school. We are alumni of our own schools. I know we can say we have to speak to the Ministry of Education, but we know that it can take a while by the time they include those subjects in school curriculum. How about us? We have alumni. We are alumni of our former universities or alma mater. We have these things in French we call journée carrière, where we go back to our former schools and speak to juniors, and we can organize our own panel sessions on these issues in our schools or our former schools. That could be a way to trigger interest around these issues that are quite key. And now I'm going to speak in French because I want to address the woman from Chad. So I'll give you like some time to put on your headset. OK. Donc, déjà, merci d'avoir posé cette question-là parce que c'est une question essentielle. Et vous avez même donné une réponse déjà à la question que vous avez posée quand il s'agit d'inclure la population dans les décisions économiques qui les touchent. C'est essentiel. Je pense que ça rejoint aussi la question de l'éducation. C'est-à-dire, on ne doit pas seulement se limiter à ce genre de salle-là auquel les personnes lambda n'ont pas accès pour discuter de ces questions qui touchent à l'économie, mais qui touchent aussi nos vies de tous les jours. Parce que lorsqu'on n'a pas, on va dire, on est sous le poids de la dette qui fait que nos hôpitaux ne fonctionnent pas. C'est des femmes qui meurent en couche. C'est des enfants qui meurent parce qu'ils n'ont pas accès peut-être aux couveuses. Donc, ces genres de questions-là doivent être, on va dire, simplifiées afin de les rendre, comment on dit relatable, de les rendre, please help me, afin qu'elles touchent la vie de tout le monde et que surtout, ça a un sens dans tout ce qu'on fait chaque jour. Vous voyez ce que je veux dire? Alors, vous avez parlé, par exemple, de la possibilité de sensibiliser dans nos langues locales. Et je pense que c'est le rôle que nous avons, nous tous ici. Quand on quittera cette salle et qu'on retournera chez nous à la maison, que ce soit dans nos églises, que ce soit dans nos communautés, dans nos villages, cette connaissance qu'on a amassée sur la question de la dette, la question de la fiscalité, il faut qu'on en parle dans nos familles, dans nos salons, dans nos communautés. C'est à nous de faire ce travail de mobilisation-là et de montrer à quel point ça touche les gens dans la vie de tous les jours. Voilà ce que je voulais dire. Merci.
Thank you. And Samantha?
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. I think so much has been spoken about the inequalities between the global north and the global south, so I won't dwell on that. I could speak to the one about the education system, and I agree with Aya that there are so many opportunities for us to speak to our young people about the debt issues and how we should move forward. I know there's a Young Scholars program that was done just before the debt conference started, and that's one way of ensuring that we capture the young people from their different spheres of life and teach them about the debt situation and how it's affecting our people. At Afronomics Law, we have the debt competition that we hold annually, where we invite students to write on different debt thematic areas. And it's one way of ensuring that we also have a writing culture within our young people. I know TJNA works well with the young parliamentarians. That's one way also of ensuring that we're creating the next crop of leaders that will take on the conversation. I know ZIMCODD also does mood competitions. That's one way of also getting into the schools. You get into the schools and propose a mood competition. You have the students work on a mood question, and it's all lawyerly, but you're actually addressing some key issues like ODS debt and how you can argue it at the international courts. And they also have a debt academy, of which I was a product of. I studied law. I did international economic law as a course, but I can assure you I did not learn anything about debt. The things I'm talking about now are things that I learned from ZIMCODD, and I've also then invested myself to learn about debt. So it's also about us as civil society organizations, what are we doing to ensure that we reach into the schools, we reach to the young people. It's going to be difficult to want to decolonize the education systems because it's a whole process. But while we advocate for that, let's also take some of these measures. I think I'll rest here.
And finally, Ishmael.
Thanks. I think most of the questions have been responded to. There was one, the last one, from the beautiful young lady from South Africa, who spoke about new leaders taking an interest in debt. And I think this is very important. I don't think we have many young leaders that are responding to the current issues. So because we're in Ghana and I'm not in my home country, I can speak about my president. Unfortunately, our president is known to be very Western-driven. He sides a lot with the West, and it places us in such a position. And sometimes I feel so embarrassed to sometimes call myself a Zambian because I've seen videos and I've watched sessions where the IMF are praising, say, yeah, Zambia is doing exactly what we are telling them to do. They have met these, everyone in the room clap for Zambia. And it's just so humiliating that we don't have leaders that can stand up and say, this system is not working for us, it is perpetuating inequalities, we need to change things. So I think I don't know, like you have mentioned, we need to build capacity in some of the young parliamentarians. We need to continually work with upcoming leaders. It connects to the point about our education systems. And as I conclude, us as civil society organizations have a big role to play in holding our governments to account for the decisions that they're making, but then at the same time, holding a lot of these international financial institutions for a lot of the regressive policies that they are pushing onto our countries. This is a fight that we must continue, linking it to the conference theme on decolonization. I think each and every one of us have a role to play, and it's a conversation that must not end here. But when we go back to our respective countries in the work that we are continually doing, these are conversations that we must carry forward. Thank you.
Thank you. We end it at that note. A big round of applause for our panelists.